Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are looking at something that honestly feels like it is pulled straight out of this morning's news.
Yeah, it really does.
You look at the headlines and you see tariffs, trade wars, protectionism, nations accusing each other of currency manipulation.
Right.
It feels very much like a specifically modern anxiety. But looking at this stack of AP European history data you brought in for us today,
It is definitely not modern.
not at all.
No, it's actually ancient news.
Hmm.
If you want to understand why nations behave the way they do today, or why a trade deficit makes politicians sweat,
Mm-hmm.
you really have to go back to the operating system that ran the world for over 150 years.
An operating system.
Yeah. Think of it as the source code for the modern world. We are talking about the era roughly between 1648.
Which was the end of the religious wars.
Exactly. From 1648 up to 1815 with the fall of Napoleon,
Uh-huh.
the software running in the background of everything was called mercantilism.
Mercantilism. I feel like that's one of those words I circled in a high school textbook and immediately forgot.
Most people do,
Yeah.
because it sounds dry.
Yeah, it really does.
But here's the thing. It wasn't just a dusty economic theory. It was an entire worldview. It was the backbone of the age of absolutism.
Right.
It explains why European maps look the way they do, why certain foods are global staples, and honestly, it explains how nations decided to get rich before modern capitalism really even existed.
So that is our mission for today. For everyone listening, we are going to strip down the engine of the 17th and 18th centuries to see how this machine actually worked.
Yes.
And looking at these sources, we've got analyses of economic development, global trade networks, the consumer revolution. It seems like this machine ran on a pretty brutal logic.
It did. It was an architecture of wealth built on gold, massive fleets, and a whole lot of human exploitation.
So let's start with the logic itself. Because today, if I ask, is a country wealthy, we talk about GDP or innovation, tech sector.
Right? We think about potential.
We think of wealth as something you can grow.
Exactly. If I start a business and you start a business, we can both get rich. The pie gets bigger, but the mercantilist doesn't see it that way at all. And this is really the single most important insight from the research. To a 17th century state, wealth was not abstract. It was purely physical.
You mean literal gold and silver?
Yes. Mineral wealth, bullion. They believed the global supply of wealth was completely fixed. Like there's only so much gold in the ground,
So if the global economy is a pie,
and the pie cannot grow.
then the only way for me to get a bigger slice is to take yours.
Precisely. It is the ultimate zero-sum game.
Wow.
Yeah, every time a rival nation brought in a shipment of silver, England and France didn't just see a competitor getting richer, they literally felt themselves getting poorer.
That sounds incredibly stressful. I mean, it turns basic trade into warfare.
It was warfare, sometimes literally with cannons, but mostly economic warfare. And the strategy was very simple. You needed a favorable balance of trade.
Which means exports are good and imports are bad.
Exactly. You want to sell more to other countries than you buy from them. Because if I sell you cloth, you give me gold. I win and you lose. But if I buy your wine, I have to give you gold. So you win and I lose.
So the goal of the state is to basically become a hoarder. Just sit on a giant pile of metal.
In a way, yes.
Right.
But you have to remember why they were hoarding. This was the age of absolutism.
Right, the kings and queens.
Yes. Monarchs needed armies, and armies needed to be paid. Paper money wasn't really a thing yet, or at least it wasn't trusted internationally.
So if you ran out of gold,
Your mercenaries went home. Or worse, they turned on you. So hoarding gold was literally a matter of national survival.
that makes sense. But it's interesting because today we think of the economy as being driven by private individuals, right?
Right.
But under this system, the government is completely in charge.
Right, it's a command economy.
Right.
The state dictated manufacturing and trade goals to serve national power. The monarch would say, we need to make better glass so we can stop buying it from Venice.
And losing gold to Venice.
Exactly. So the state would just subsidize a glass factory. It wasn't about what the free market wanted. It was about keeping the gold at home.
Okay, but here's where the logic kind of trips me up.
Okay.
If every country in Europe is playing by these exact same rules, they all want to export everything and import absolutely nothing, surely the system just gridlocks, right?
Yes.
Because who is buying all this stuff if everyone refuses to import?
You have hit on the exact fatal flaw of the logic. If Europe is a closed room, the trade just stops. So they had to break out of the room. They needed a loophole.
And that loophole was the colonies.
Correct. This is why the map of the world was suddenly painted in European colors. Colonies were the engine of the system. They solved the math problem in two very specific ways.
Let's break those down. The sources talk about raw materials first.
Right. So imagine you are the mother country. You need to build ships to protect your trade. Ships need timber.
But maybe you don't have enough forests left at home.
You don't. So you could buy timber from a rival and lose your gold.
Which breaks the rule.
Terribly. So
Wow.
instead you take it from your own colony, like timber from British North America or sugar from French Caribbean colonies.
So you get the materials, but the gold stays inside your own empire.
Exactly. But there is a second function, and this one is really quite clever: captive markets.
Yeah, the sources mention this, and it feels very controlling.
It is incredibly controlling
Yeah.
because colonies were forced customers. They had to buy manufactured goods strictly from the parent country.
So if I'm a colonist, I can't just look for the best price on the global market.
Not legally, no.
No.
The wealth was designed to only flow one way.
Okay, so that is the economic engine on paper. But when we move to the next section of the research, we see the real human cost of this.
Yes.
Because this system linked Europe, Africa, the Americas, and Asia into this massive global network. And the mechanism driving the Atlantic side of this was the triangular trade.
Right. We need to be very clear, based on the historical analysis here. This wasn't just trading goods, it was the commodification of human beings.
Walk us through the corners of that triangle.
So leg one, finished goods like guns and textiles are sent from Europe down to Africa.
Where they are exchanged for enslaved laborers.
Yes. Which leads to leg two, the Middle Passage, the transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic.
And the sources are incredibly stark about this. The brutality, the malnourishment, the disease.
The conditions were horrific. And what is vital to understand from a mercantilist perspective is that these humans were treated strictly as commodities on a balance sheet.
Because the entire system needed massive amounts of labor for leg three of the triangle.
Exactly. The Americas to Europe. Enslaved labor produces the raw materials: the cotton, the tobacco, the sugar, the molasses.
And that gets sent back to Europe.
Right, to be processed and sold, keeping the wealth within the empire.
The sources point out that it was specifically the demand for these plantation crops like sugar and tobacco that drove the slave trade.
It was. European laborers wouldn't survive the tropical diseases on Caribbean plantations, and indigenous populations in the Americas had been decimated by European diseases.
Like smallpox.
Yes. So the system turned to enslaved African labor, and it fundamentally reshaped the demographics of three entire continents.
All to fuel this zero-sum economic machine.
Yes.
It's a very dark reality. But then the conversation in the sources pivots to what was happening back home in Europe.
the consumer revolution.
Right. And the contrast is jarring because you have this brutal extraction happening globally, but inside Europe, daily life is transforming in this seemingly positive way.
It completely changed what it meant to live in Europe. Let's start with dietary changes. The introduction of new staples.
Maize and potatoes.
Yes, these crops increased the food supply dramatically.
Because you can grow a lot more calories per acre of potatoes than wheat.
Exactly, which led to massive population growth. It actually allowed for urbanization because you could feed more people in cities.
And once they are in the cities, they start wanting the goods coming from the colonies.
Things that used to be luxury items for the super rich suddenly became everyday habits for a growing middle class.
We're talking about sugar, tobacco, coffee, rum, tea, silks.
Right. And think about the social impact of that. Before this, if you wanted to drink in London, you drank weak beer. Suddenly you have access to hot, caffeinated, sugary beverages.
Which gave rise to coffeehouse culture.
Exactly. People are gathering, they're energized, they're discussing politics and business. It signaled the rise of a new middle class with disposable income.
So they want refined textiles, they want porcelain cups.
They want to consume. That is
Yeah.
the consumer revolution.
But that desire to consume at the best price directly conflicts with the mercantilist state wanting to control all the wealth, right?
Yes. And that brings us perfectly to our case study. To see how this friction actually played out, we have to look at the British Navigation Acts.
Started by Oliver Cromwell in the mid-17th century.
Right. So here is the law. All goods shipped to Britain or any of its colonies had to be transported on British ships with British crews.
No exception.
No exceptions. The goal was to completely cut out middlemen nations.
Specifically the Dutch, right?
Yes. The Dutch were dominating global shipping at the time. Britain wanted to ensure every single penny of profit stayed within the British Empire.
So they forced their own colonists to use British shipping even if the Dutch offered a much better rate.
Exactly. And while it's successfully strengthened the British Navy and their merchant marine, it caused massive friction.
I can imagine. If you were a colonist, you are basically banned from participating in the global free market,
You are subsidizing the British Empire out of your own pocket.
which inevitably becomes a major
A
grievance.
massive one. It is a direct line to the American Revolution. The economic frustration of being a captive market eventually boiled over.
So zooming out and looking at this whole journey, you have a desire for gold that leads to state-controlled economies,
Yes.
which births colonial empires and the transatlantic slave trade, which then floods Europe with new goods and creates a middle class.
It is a massive chain reaction. And the big picture takeaway from these sources is how this era consolidated European economic dominance.
Right.
The sheer amount of capital that was extracted and concentrated during this mercantilist period provided the necessary funding for the next big phase of history.
Industrialization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't get massive factories without the capital accumulated through this 150-year system.
That is fascinating. So the source material starts by saying mercantilism was based on this idea of a finite pie.
The zero-sum game.
Right. But it leaves us with a really provocative final thought. If mercantilism was all about fighting over slices of a fixed pie, did the eventual transition to industrialization finally prove that the pie could actually be grown?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you wonder how much of our current world, the way we trade, the way we consume, is still running on roots and habits shaped back in the 17th century.
A surprising amount, I would say.
Something for everyone listening to mull over today. Thank you for walking us through this research.
Absolutely my pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.